Good afternoon, all after a refreshing coffee. Thank you, Thijs, for the organization and opportunity to present here our work, where I would like to present you our experiences with nanocellulose fabrication, modification, and application. So actually, our experience comes from the paper-making side, but thanks to the involvement in AAA code, we are able to extend our experiences towards other applications and substrates. So who are we? We are Sirris. We are a collective research organization in Belgium, actually helping companies with realizing their technological innovations. And we mainly do this by detecting collective needs within a certain sector and then define collective research projects to generate general knowledge and also transfer this knowledge into real applications by one-to-one projects with companies and working towards real applications. We do this in different fields, creating products of the future, manufacturing of the future, or businesses of the future. And within these three lines, we have actually cross-domain programs in order to realize our projects. We are about 170 colleagues working in the different fields and spread within seven different locations all over Belgium. So my group, we name us Innovations in Circular Economy, and we are mainly working according to three different pillars related to materials, processing, and characterization. There, mainly, we want to help companies make the transition into a circular economy by implementing new bio-based materials or the revalorization of bio-based waste streams and turn them into functional products. The second pillar is actually parallel with our testing department, where we mainly want to improve the lifetime of materials and components. So, for example, by coating formulation, by mechanical testing, or by chemical and corrosion resistance testing. And the third pillar is then more business approach, where we help companies in setting up a circular economy-proofed business model. And mainly for the second pillar, of course, we also have access to our testing labs for surface preparation, for coating formulation, and for mechanical or chemical testing. So our involvement in the nanocellulose field originated from previous experiences with paper coatings, where we wanted to improve the properties of papers, mainly, for example, for packaging papers, by the development of barrier coatings. We already heard in the previous talk that nanocellulose might bring there some benefits, mainly because of the oxygen barrier resistance. And I will show you some results about that. But in paper making, the application of nanocellulose mainly is in parallel with known processes in paper making. If you think about, for example, slot die coating or filtration processes. But these have limitations, of course, mainly, for example, if you think about the processing of high solid content coatings. If you want to make a transformation into continuous coating processes, if we want to have better control on the dewatering processes by nanocellulose coating, then, for example, we can think about the application of spray coating. And of course, if you also look into other substrates or 3D forms, spray coating becomes a technique that is necessary to use. And the intrinsic properties in order to be able to spray coat nanocellulose or the rheological characteristics, where you see indeed a strong decrease in viscosity as a function of the shear of the coating. This means if a high shear is applied on the coating, that we can get here low viscosity, which makes the nanocellulose spray coatable, mainly, for example, due to orientation of the fibrils under the pressure of the spray coating. Otherwise, if the tension is released, the nanocellulose can recover, it regains its viscosity, and it can dry into a solid film. So therefore, nanocellulose is often added into coating formulations, paper coating formulations, to control rheological properties, to improve stability of dispersing agents, or to prevent phase separations in coatings. But as the work shown here and also in the AAA code, we are also interested in application of the pure nanocellulose coatings. And so one method to produce the nanocellulose is through mechanical fibrillation. We do it in the lab with an homogenizer. It's actually a high pressure chamber where pulp suspension is circulated many times under high pressure in order to introduce the fibrillation of the cellulose. This can be done in different interaction chambers in order to introduce high shear rates on the material. And depending on the number of steps, you get here either, for example, microfibrillated cellulose or nanofibrillated cellulose. Of course, it's a very high energy intensive process because we need to break actually the hydrogen bonding into the cellulose structure. So it's not the most energy efficient process. As you see here, that high amounts of energy consumptions are needed. So at the moment, we are also involved in projects where this fibrillation process can be enhanced. For example, through pre-swelling of the cellulose fibers. Through pre-swelling, for example, you can open the structure and weaken the interactions between the cellulose fibrils in order to have a more fluent fibrillation. And one technique that we use here is the use of interaction with ionic liquids, where after the processing, these ionic liquids can be recycled again from the processing, or eventually direct processing into nanocellulose composites can directly be done in this ionic liquid phase. So here you see some lab results where we have applied different number of passes, either into a homogenizer, into a 200 micrometer chamber or 87 micrometer chamber. And of course, with increasing number of passes, we see the increasing fibrillation and decrease in sizes of the nanocellulose fibrils. One parameter to control the suspension stability is the zeta potential that we have measured. It's a measure for the interaction of the fibrils. And what you see, for example, indeed, with increasing fibrillation, you have a decrease in zeta potential. But if the fibrillation becomes too high, of course, you have again the agglomeration of the fibrils, which is reflected here also in an increase in the zeta potential. And if you look into the rheological properties of such fibrillated structures, it can nicely be related to the morphology of the microfibrillated cellulose. Here, for example, you see in only homogenizer fibrillation, where we have like an increase in viscosity, a very slight increase from the red to the purple, an increase with increasing fibrillation. But once we go too far into the fibrillation, we see a decrease in viscosity, indicating the agglomeration of the fibrils. If you do the rheological scan over a larger shear rate domain, you typically see these characteristics for fibrillated cellulose, with here occurring often some Newtonian plateaus, indicating the timely aggregation of the fibrils and then again the breaking up of these aggregates. Actually, by these tests, we could define one specific rheological parameter, which is the Piclet number, including here the viscosity and also the geometry, the length and the diameter of the nanofibrils. And we see a relation with the total number of the passes with the viscosity properties of the cellulose. So in the second step, we already talked that cellulose is very hydrophilic, and often a hydrophobic modification of the nanocellulose is applied. It's often done by hard chemistry, by grafting techniques, for example. Here in this technique, we have deposited like hydrophobic nanoparticles, which contain about 70% of carnauba wax that are physically attached to the nanocellulose and turn them into hydrophobic properties. If we then look into the rheological properties, here again you see the MFC, the microfibrillated. We go to the nanofibrillated with an increase in viscosity due to the fibrillation. And if we then compare with the surface modified micro or nanofibrillated cellulose, we see that we can bring down here the viscosity into almost an equal number, both for the microfibrillated and the nanofibrillated cellulose, so that the viscosity is actually more determined by the surface characteristics of our fibrillated cellulose. And here indeed in the networks, you see the incorporation of these hydrophobic particles, either for the microfibrillated or the nanofibrillated cellulose. Otherwise, for example, if we compare this chemical modification with just physical mixing of the hydrophobic compounds, we see that we end up with a completely different rheological pattern, which is here more in the turquoise color and does not attain the lowering of the viscosity. Other interesting rheological properties can also be determined from oscillatory rheology, where we get more insight into the network formation of the fibrillated cellulose. For example, here we see for the MFC, there's an increase in storage modulus, and again, the decrease after modification. But it's interesting to look into the differentiation between gel-like or liquid-like behavior of the materials. And we see, for example, here, actually the transition point between gel-like and liquid-like is determined by the crossover of the viscous modulus and the storage modulus. And then we see, for example, for the modified cellulose, that we obtain here a relatively larger operational window where the suspension behaves like a liquid-like properties. So then we have used these materials for a spray coating deposition, and we did some experimental optimization of the spray coating conditions. And here, for example, we can have a variation in the pressure or in the nozzle diameter. Here with an increase in nozzle diameter, you see an increase in the coating weight that was deposited. Here we used first paper as a model substrate. Otherwise, the pressure was less critical until here at the very high pressures. Actually, you see that we completely press the coating into the porous paper structure. Otherwise, we have also screened the effect of the concentrations. If you do the spray coating here at the high concentrations, we see inhomogeneous clogging of the materials in the coatings, which you see here like a bundle of microfibrils present in the coating. But for example, then we determined here a favorable operational regime with 1.5 weight %, where you see a very nice linear increase in coating weight depending on the number of depositing steps, so 2 to 20 spray coating steps over the paper. Actually, the important parameters for spray coating of these materials are the flow rate that can be obtained. And here we have characterized the flow rate as a function of the concentration of our CNF or CNC in the suspension. So in this study, we have included 2 commercial types of CNC. And there we see that we can spray coat up to 4.5 weight%. And 2 types are shown here in morphology. And we find very surprisingly very good correspondence in the flow rate characteristics for these materials. When playing around with the nozzle opening and or applying a higher pressure, we can, the flow rate has been decreased and we end up here into this yellow characteristic. For the microfibrillated materials, viscosity, of course, plays a very big role, as the lower viscosity will allow for the higher flow rates. For example, here in the open boxes, you have the MFC, the microfibrillated cellulose. If the cellulose gets more and more fibrillated, this characteristics comes down a little bit with higher degree of fibrillation. And if we compare this with the surface modified fibrillated cellulose with the deposition of these hydrophobic nanoparticles, we have indeed indicated that the viscosity has lowered and we get higher flow rates following this characteristic here. So when we now deposit or when we screen the effect of the CNF concentration in suspension as a function of the coating weight, then indeed we see 2 different regimes for deposition, where we are here at low concentrations in the liquid-like conditions. There we see a linear increase in the coating weight with suspension concentration. And here at the end, at the higher concentrations, we end up into the gel-like phase, where you see here the clogging of the materials in the coating. And for example, for the different materials, we have here determined optimized spray coating content for the different materials, where for the fibrillated, we are at 1.5. For the CNCs, we can spray coat at 4.5%. And for the modified, we go from 4 to 7% solid content into our suspension. And here you just see some photos of spray-coated papers, where you have here the increase in number of deposition steps with the gradual increase in homogeneity of our coating. So in paper coating applications, the oxygen resistance is a main property. So here we have determined the oxygen transmission rate for coated papers. Here the sample numbers, these are the different samples that we have collected from the microfluidizer production. So when we see indeed that we get here some optimized fibrillation conditions for the cellulose in order to provide lowest OTR values. And this regime corresponds here actually to the lowest viscosity parameters of the suspensions, which actually indicates that the formation of a homogeneous film is very determining in the creation of coatings with a high or with a low OTR value. Of course, this OTR is also highly dependent on the humidity. Therefore, the hydrophobic control of the nanocellulose is of importance. And here, for example, if we deposit this modified nanocellulose, We can control the release of the wax out of the nanoparticles, and finally can control the contact angles of the coatings going up to 150 degrees, for example, and providing very high hydrophobic protection. And here you see some effect of this release, where you see here the nanoparticles deposited onto the microfibrils that become here released, and they form like wax patches on top of the surface. And indeed, this has an influence here also on the OTR values. As you see, we have tested the OTR at two different relative humidities, 50 and 70%. As expected, for the non-modified, we have a high increase in OTR. Otherwise, after release, we see, for example, here, after release at 135 degrees Celsius, we obtain lowest OTR values, and it's also less sensitive to variations in relative humidity. So now, in frame of the AAA code, we have also transferred our knowledge to other substrates. Here, for example, textile substrates, where we have deposited on a viscose substrate. Here you see the characteristic for the viscose with the CNF, for example, which is very parallel to the paper reference materials. So actually both materials are cellulose-based. It was more or less what we could have expected. Otherwise, if we transfer it to a polyester fabric, you see here the polyester, for example, is much more open or much higher porosity. You see that we get a kind of other characteristic. So likely here we first start to fill the pores of the substrate. Once the pores are filled, you see that it more or less evolves parallel with the other substrates, as we have just the stacking of the nanocellulose layers on top of each other. And here in these photographs, indeed, you see the filling of the gaps in the polyester structure more and more until it forms here a homogeneous surface layer. What we see for the CNF, for example, is that the coating is much more weaker at the moment. It's pure CNC. And here we see the occurrence of some cracks into the coating structure, which further have to be improved. Then just want to switch towards my final two slides, where we are now looking into further possibilities for patterning these coatings. Here we are working together with colleagues in Sirris that are using laser patterning and laser cutting. And for example, here we have experimented with the texturing of a spray-coated CNF layer, where, for example, we can form this kind of island-like domains with different pitch sizes and also controlled dimensions of these channels into the coating. Otherwise, by changing the pulse rate, for example, we can also perform just perforation of the coating, which can be very interesting to control the porosity of this kind of nanocellulose films. And at the moment, we are also trying to replicate some antimicrobially efficient patterns. For example, where we can replicate a line pattern into this spray-coated CNF layer, or where we can incorporate this kind of fission-grade zigzag pattern. These are two types of patterns that have been tried by our colleagues already on hard surfaces and could show some additional antimicrobial activity. So in conclusion, we want to have good control onto the nanocellulose suspension properties, influences of the fiber morphologies and surface modification on the rheology, viscosity, and linked to the spraying coating application. The control of substrate interactions seems to be quite difficult depending on wettability, roughness, hardness, porosity. So a number of parameters to be controlled. So we are looking into the future with this project into the testing of different other morphologies or chemistries for this interface adhesion layer. And the functionalities I have shown you, for example, is the controlled release to control hydrophobicity, which might also have an influence on antimicrobial properties, and how can we texture antimicrobial patterns through laser texture. That brings me to the end without thanking, of course, all the partners within the AAA Code project, funding by the EU, and a very nice cooperation with all partners amongst you. Thank you.